So why are the older generations and the younger generations so split on Brexit? The younger generations want to remain, older generations want to leave. Well, in this video, I'm going to answer the question by visiting the world in which you grew up and comparing it to today's. So, if you're 65 and over, you became politically aware between 1953 and 1968. Winston Churchill was Prime Minister in 1951. Elizabeth became Queen in 1952, and Sir Anthony Eden became Prime Minister in 1955 when Churchill retired. He was a Tory Prime Minister. Anthony Eden then resigned and was replaced by Harold Macmillan in 1957, another Tory Prime Minister. In 1958, the motorway system opened, and in 1959, Harold Macmillan wins the general election. 1963 showed France vetoing Britain's entry into the European Common Market. 1963 also showed Harold Macmillan resigned, making Sir Alec Douglas becoming Prime Minister. You saw the rise of supermarkets, and then Harold Wilson, Labour, became Prime Minister. You saw the abolition of the death penalty. You saw the introduction of the comprehensive education system. In 1966, Labour strengthened its parliamentary position. And in 1968, you saw abortion and homosexuality legalised. 3% of the population back then was foreign-born, compared to 13% now. 65% of you are leavers, 34% of you are remainers. 51% of you want to end free movement of labour, 29% of you want to stay in the single market, 59% of you don't want a second referendum. That compares to 29% who do. If you're between 54 and 64 years of age, you became politically aware between 1969 and 1978. In 1970, the Conservative government under Edward Heath became Prime Minister. In 1971, North Sea oil concessions were auctioned, and in 1973, Britain joined the European Economic Community. In 1974, we had a hung parliament with Harold Wilson as Prime Minister. Also, later in that year, 1974, we had a second election with Harold Wilson, Labour, gaining a majority. 1975 showed the first referendum to join the European Economic Community. And 1976 showed Harold Wilson resign and be replaced by James Callaghan. Britain was forced to borrow money from the International Monetary Fund, and in 1978, strikes paralysed Britain during the winter of discontent. For the 55 to 64 year olds, net migration in this period was between minus 41,000 and minus 5,000. 58% of you are leavers, 41% of you are remainers. 43% of you want to end free movement of labour, and 54% of you don't want a second, or for you guys, a third referendum. If you're between 45 and 54, you became politically aware between 1979 and 1988. Thatcher became the first female Prime Minister in 1979. Scotland and Wales rejected devolution back then. 1981 saw racial tensions spark riots in Brixton and other areas. 1982 saw Thatcher re-elected by a landslide. 1984 saw a 12-month miners' strike. And 1986 saw major national industries privatised. In 1987, Thatcher won a third term. For you, net migration fluctuated. It fell from 6,000 to minus 79,000 in 1979 to 1981, but rose to 58,000 in 1985, then back down to minus 21,000 in 1988. 55% of you are leavers and 45% of you are remainers. 40% of you want to end free movement, 35% of you want to stay in the single market, and 43% of you don't want a second referendum. So, the 35 to 44 year olds, you became politically aware between 1989 and 1998. In 1990, Thatcher resigned so that John Major became Prime Minister. In 1992, the Conservatives won the general election with John Major. In 1994, women priests were ordained by the church. And in 1997, Tony Blair won by a huge majority. Also in 1997, Scotland and Wales vote in favour of devolution, and 1998 saw the Good Friday Agreement. In this period, net migration rose from 44,000 to 140,000. 55% of you want to remain, 44% of you want to leave, 41% of you want to stay in the single market, with just 25% of you wanting to end free movement. 43% of you want a second referendum. If you're between 25 and 34, you became politically aware between 1999 and 2008. In 1999, Britain decided not to join the European single currency. In 2000, the dot-com bubble burst. In 2001, the foot and mouth disease became a thing. Labour won a second term in 2001, but also in 2001, we had 9/11. 2003 saw Britain invade Iraq. By 2004, 10 new states joined the European Union. 2005 saw Labour win its third term. Civil partnerships giving same-sex couples the same legal rights as heterosexual couples were introduced. And in 2007, Tony Blair resigned, giving Gordon Brown the prime ministerialship. In 2008, we had the banking crisis. So net migration in this period rose between 163,000 and 229,000. 65% of you are Remainers, 31% of you are Leavers, 50% of you want to stay in the single market, 43% of you want a second referendum, with 33% saying no to that. And finally, if you're 18 to 24, you became politically aware between 2009 and 2018. In 2010, David Cameron became the Prime Minister in coalition with the Liberal Democrats. In 2014, Scotland voted no to independence. In 2015, David Cameron became the Prime Minister with a slight majority. In 2016, we had the EU referendum, and in 2017, Theresa May lost that majority. And of course, everything has happened since. In this period, net migration rose from 229,000 to 282,000. 81% of you are Remainers, 18% of you are Leavers, 50% of you want to stay in the single market, and 49% of this generation want a second referendum, 30% don't. So the over 45s have seen fluctuations in net migration when they were growing up, but the under 45s have always seen it in the positive, and it's risen since, so the differences to the younger generations are less noticeable. But the generations also have different ways of thinking. For example, the over 65s are the pre-EU generation. The 55 to 64s are the first referendum generation. The 54s to 45s are the Thatcher generation. And the Tories are like Marmite with people, you either love them or you hate them. The 35 to 44s are the Good Friday generation. The 25 to 34s are the Blair generation. And that's where a lot of anti-establishment thinking comes from after the Iraq War. But the 18 to 24s are the BREXIT generation, and they're the ones that have only ever known Cameron and May's mistake. So if you're 65 and over, you have seen the biggest political deterioration, while the 18 to 24s have only ever known it to be like this. But I would stress that not everyone feels the same way, and it really depends who you blame for economic and political uncertainty. Do you blame immigrants? Do you blame the politicians? Or do you blame the general public? Let me know your opinions in the debate below, and subscribe.